what is driving the trend of marketers wanting to take control?
That's what agencies are brilliant at.
And we think that there is a huge risk involved in in-housing. In-housing of media, it's not a fad, it is a trend.
Yes.
So we're going to just use some time here. Let's just talk about in-housing.
Yeah.
It's a really kind of big topic. So we're going to think about, well, first of all, let's just talk about what it is, why it's happening, because we can draw lines back to some key things which we think have kind of triggered this. We're going to look at who's doing it, because there's a number of different people experimenting in that area. And also then how to do it, or perhaps more how to avoid some of the pitfalls. And we think that there is a huge risk involved in in-housing. So what is it? How do we define in-housing?
So in-housing is when advertisers bring the responsibility of key disciplines within kind of media management and media buying in-house, taking that responsibility away from their agencies.
Yeah. And it's not building an agency in-house necessarily. It doesn't mean firing your agency, right? It's just making decisions about what you're going to do yourself and what you want your agencies to do. And that's quite a good exercise to go through anyway. So why is it happening? What has driven it now? Because it comes up again and again, and the last 6 months or 9 months or so, we're getting more and more advertisers asking us to define these operating models, and more suggesting that they want to take greater control or in-house some of their media. So what's driving that?
I think most advertisers that are considering it are being sensible. They're looking to future-proof the way that they manage media, in line with the way that the market is going. As more and more media becomes biddable in its execution, there will become less reliance on their agency partners to drive better pricing through scale. And that's something that enables them the responsibilities or the power to sort of do it internally. So they're future-proofing their business, but by looking at the dynamics and the way that the market is going.
Yeah, exactly. And this is something we talked about this a little bit on Media Snack before. This idea that agencies over the years have aggregated buying scale, and what we mean by that is that they just pull lots of advertisers' money together so they can negotiate better prices for everybody and better value. In a biddable market, so when you're buying in an auction-based method, scale becomes less important, because you bid as an advertiser, you would bid on a particular piece of media inventory based on how valuable you think that is. So the smarter you can be, you can exercise brain power in this case, not so much buying power. The smarter that you can be, the better. That gives you competitive advantage. And now you've got some really big companies. These are not just these, what we call the high performance digital marketers, like on the fringes of the industry perhaps, even though some of them are quite substantial. But big legacy CPG brands, big global CPG brands, and big legacy companies now realizing that their scale is less competitive advantage perhaps than it was. And I think at the beginning of this year, P&G is one example. Mark Pritchard, Chief Brand Officer, he seems to be the darling of Media Snack because we talk about him almost every week. But there's a reason for that, because he said at the beginning of the year, we're taking more control. And he said, we're putting our hands back on the keyboard, which is a very nice description. And
I think that's it. It's about control. Okay, and it's about taking accountability for media decision making in the most important way internally. Okay, now everything being equal, you would rather have your own employees making critical decisions around how to spend your media to drive a business outcome than perhaps outsourcing that to a third party. So I think as the market becomes more adaptable to in-house media buying, then it's just going to become more and more prevalent.
And one of the big questions on that is, it's a bit chicken and egg. Like, is it being driven by marketers' desire to take control, or is this a response to a lack of delivery from agencies? Is this a failure of media agencies that's causing marketers? And I think there's a good case to make there. It's going to be a balance of probably both of those things. But as a marketer, as a buyer of media, if my marketplace is not innovating in the way that I need to, I will just take control and I will drive the innovation I need to maintain competitive advantage. So if I'm not getting that, So that's a big question when it comes to in-housing. You know, the agencies have got to account for what is driving the trend of marketers wanting to take control. You cannot stand by and say like, hey, it's nothing, we had nothing to do with this, because if you were supplying the solution for a CMO that reassured them of all of the things that they're seeking, then you'd imagine that that would be a thriving new agency industry. And you'd have less advertisers saying, you know what, we're just going to do it ourselves.
Yeah.
So I think it's a failing on that side. I don't know what the answer is for an agency, but I think they've missed an opportunity. And the risk now is that they're going to see, you know, things slipping through their fingers, because the trend now seems to be marketers figuring out, actually, this is quite a good strategy.
Absolutely. And keeping that knowledge base internal, right? And beginning to build on that and continuing to become slightly more adaptive and predictive in the way that you kind of go to market and you buy your media. Yeah,
exactly. And like data's the thing. So let's just think about, so who is in-housing media right now? This is a little while back, we'll link back to it, but we talk a lot here about the 5 states of control when it comes to media. And really that's a kind of progression of control, which you'll see in the video linked above, from very decentralized, delegating off to agency control at one end, through to the other extreme, which is full in-housing. And most people, of course, are somewhere on that spectrum in between. But the trend is to be fragmenting scope, which is what we mean by that is a marketer saying, let's look at all of the media function end to end and figure out what we need to build ourselves and actually what we need to buy externally. And that's changing the way they work with external agencies. But the build ourselves is the beginning of in-housing. What should we control ourselves? And so in that video, in the in-housing, we talked about 2 types of advertising, right?
So we talked about businesses that are predominantly performance online businesses that have organically grown their own internal agency requirements because that's the way that the business goes. Businesses like EA or Netflix. But then more increasingly now there are those big businesses that spend a lot of money that are looking to be far more sophisticated in their usage of data to enable them to experiment with in-housing. And Anheuser-Busch is a good example of that. RBS are exploring in-housing. L'Oreal are doing it. And probably the most high-profile big business that has gone live with this is Vodafone, right? So to great fanfare, they've in-housed or decided to in-house all of their programmatic buying and taken that away from their incumbent media agency.
Yeah, exactly. And which relies on all of the things that we've just been talking about. You know, as we understand, some of the motivation for that was the opportunity to get just greater transparency of the supply chain, take greater control, all of those things. But for these businesses that have, there's lots of them that have traditionally relied on buying media on an industrial scale. You know, we talk about a P&G or a L'Oreal or a Reckitt's and Vodafone. These are big mass market advertisers. These aren't advertisers who want to improve a bit of their programmatic digital buying. They are starting with that to build the capability. So this is a long-term play. They're building for the future.
Absolutely.
That's I think the most interesting thing. This is why we say it's a trend and not a fad. And there's been tons of research already into this. And it's just the early days, but tons of research. WFA did a good piece last year. Digiday, the trade publication, Infectious Media, which is an independent programmatic agency, all been looking at trends in-housing, and they all come up with different numbers, but the trend that they're all showing is that in-housing is growing, has grown, and the trend is going to continue.
Absolutely, and that's reflected actually in the conversations that we have, almost without exception. There are 2 themes of inquiry when brands come and talk to us. The first is operating models, how to begin to start looking at operating models to get the very most out of media. But secondly is what to consider when thinking about in-housing, or how to develop a strategy when looking at in-housing in the future.
Yeah, okay, let's talk about how. Okay, so when we talk about how, I mean, our hypothesis here is that some of this is going to end badly.
Undoubtedly.
So let's just think about where it's going to go wrong,
Yeah.
first off. So what are the kind of areas to be aware of for anyone thinking about
Yeah.
in-housing or toying with the idea?
Well, firstly, I mean, it's a big undertaking,
Yeah.
and it needs to be considered properly. I think those that perhaps are more likely to fail are the ones that just don't prepare strategically for such an important kind of initiative internally.
Yeah, it's a long-term investment. Remember, it's a trend, not a fad. This isn't we can buy media ourselves like right now and save some money. Although some of the case studies, AB InBev is a really good example of where they're very good at kind of documenting, tracking progress, and they are showing that they're realizing savings, and they can reinvest. That's what Pritchard said. I want to reinvest in the craft of creativity. It's great motivation. But it's a long-term strategy. It's not a tactic. So that the prep and the planning is critical. Otherwise, it's destined to fail.
And those that kind of see this as the next big silver bullet, and perhaps look at in-housing in a knee-jerk reaction, wanting to kind of get to the top of the kind of curve and do it in an ill-considered way, I think are likely to fail.
Yeah. And one of the things I would be really concerned about, and we can kind of sense this in some places, I think this might be happening, is that taking buying away from your agency that you've worked with for maybe a long time, you've got a good relationship with, that's a sizable chunk of their scope.
Yeah.
So that means that leaves them with the resource, and also it's probably a sizable chunk of their income and their profit, particularly in the digital stuff. I mean, that's been regarded as highly profitable for agencies. You're taking away something which is quite valuable. You just need to do that very carefully, the way that you kind of extract that from the agency so that you can maintain their level of support in those disciplines. You don't want to create scenarios, and we can see that these may be happening in some places where you antagonize the agency by ripping away some scope. Of course, the agencies, they're not going to hope you fail. They support you, but then maybe, long term, that's maybe good for them if it doesn't quite work out as well as you hope. So you've got to do that in a very careful way, a really good way. And this brings us to think about what's the role of a media agency in the future, which we've talked about a lot, is, if you're taking control of buying, it changes the role of the agency, and hopefully that elevates them to a more consultative role in the way that we've been strongly advocating. Yeah.
Right. I mean, for me, the biggest challenge, though, of all, which is a slightly softer challenge, is around talent.
Yeah.
And in particular, how do you maintain kind of motivation and creativity and inspiration with the talent that you bring?
Yeah.
And that's what agencies are brilliant at. Agencies are very good at inspiring the people that they work with to deliver brilliant work, because they give them different context, different clients to work with, different perspectives. When you have a team working exclusively internally, there is a danger that they may go native, right? That they become so insular in the way that they operate that you lose some kind of value because they're not being inspired from external kind of sources. And that, I think, is going to be the greatest challenge of all when it comes to businesses that bring talent in.
Yeah, exactly. So the worst fail of this is going to be where it actually just creates silos. Again, so it's got to be done in an integrated way, and your people have got to be open to outside influence. It's not something that you build a wall around. Okay, so some of the pitfalls. So approaching this, and this is definitely something we need to revisit, and we'll do. I think in a few weeks' time, we're going to come back and think about really more the practicalities and our recommendations of things that we've been advocating to some big advertisers in this space. Maybe we can share some of those kind of principles. But basically, what should marketers do? What should you be thinking then as a marketer about in-housing?
Well, you need to firstly, approach it as an investment, as you mentioned earlier on. This is not a method of saving money. Okay, so you need to look at media as an investment, as a lever for business growth, and this is a strategy by which that will be delivered.
Yeah, exactly. One of the other things as well, once you start looking at it as an investment, you start to interrogate where your money goes, because you're not buying just cheap inventory, which has been one of the failings, if you like, a lot of the kind of automated or buying models. You need verified humans being engaged and touched with your messages, and to have really full transparency over the supply chain. So that's really another start point is to figure out actually what you're doing and where your money's going as a base.
Yeah. And then probably the third thing is be ready to take control. I mean, that's what you're doing, right? You're bringing in control and responsibility of a really important part of your media management process. Be ready for it. And then you can kind of capitalize on the opportunity, but you have to be ready.
Yeah. So you learn to drive. Don't just go out and buy a car, learn to drive. That's the first thing. And that takes a little while. And you've got to have a team that can be aligned to make decisions. Otherwise, you're going to be a very lonely single person with suddenly a lot of things to play with, being asked to make decisions which impact both the business and external partners. So you need to kind of galvanize a team to start with around that. You don't need to hire, but just get everybody kind of aligned to that. And the control is coming, and this is what I think we'll talk about in our future episode. This is our general recommendation. Control comes in 3 areas. Data, that can take a long time to organize data, but it's a strategy, has to be done. Contracts, so changing the contract, change contracts with agencies, vendors, partners, platforms, tech, all these kind of things, ad serving, all have to be updated and amended. So there's a schedule of going through all of that. And then taking control of decision making. So slowly impact some decision making which historically you may have outsourced. So those are the 3 areas perhaps we'll revisit next time.
Yeah.
Right then, good week 4.
For agency leaders.
Okay.
So
not based on what we've just been talking about.
But agency leadership. Okay. Michael Roth, the CEO of IPG, is developing a succession plan, and he's taken some suggestions to the board, and I think that indicates that they are in good place, I think, to look at that kind of IPG's leadership structure. And secondly, Artur Sadoun and Steve King, leaders of Publicis Group, have been reappointed to the board. A reflection, I think, of how well regarded they are within that group as leaders. So I think that's a very big positive. Mm-hmm. So bad week 4.
Bad week. Sad to say, it's a bad week for trust and transparency. This week we published wave 2 of our global media transparency report, and loyal viewers will remember back in 2016. Which is just before the ANA's transparency report came out. Actually, it was about the same kind of time. We do some market analysis and ask marketing, media and procurement leaders from around the world. There's about 230, I think, on this wave. Their views of transparency and trust as it relates to their relationships with agencies. Mm-hmm. Things were pretty bleak in 2016. We were hoping it was going to show some kind of marked improvement because we feel that things have probably improved. But sadly, it's actually dropped a little bit in the last 2 years. So wave 2 we've just published. We'll link down below. You can download the full report from our website. The slight glimmer of hope is that there is optimism that trust is going to improve over the next 12 months. But it's a good question. Not that you answer the question, but it's a good question. Is some of this in-housing motivation related in some way to trust and transparency issues? I don't know. And that's for another time. Right, question of the week. What do you think? Will a lot of in-housing fail?
Yes, no, whatever.
Okay, so that's Media Snack for this week. Thank you very much for watching. Bye for now.
See you next time.
Yeah, in-housing and media, it's not a fad, it's a trend. Okay, ready?
Yeah.
Okay. In-housing of media is not a
fad. It's a trend.